What if the biggest royal battle isn't happening in public, but quietly, behind closed doors, where signatures matter more than crowns? Because according to reports, as King Charles III faces an uncertain future, Queen Camilla is allegedly racing against time, securing guarantees that could decide everything after him. And one man, Prince William, is already saying no. It started with something that looked small, almost invisible to the public, but inside palace circles, it changed everything. According to the transcript, a quiet legal move, filed without fanfare, suggested that Camilla may have begun preparing for a future where nothing is guaranteed anymore. And that raises a question most people aren't asking. If everything was secure, why act now? Because beneath the surface of royal tradition, there's a brutal truth most never see. Royal homes aren't truly owned in the way people think. They belong to the institution. Which means the moment the crown changes hands, so does control. And that's where the tension begins to build. Reports suggest Camilla's first and most urgent concern isn't status or power. It's something far more basic, where she will live. Think about that for a second. After decades inside the system, rising from one of the most controversial figures in royal history to queen consort, the idea that her residence could suddenly become uncertain sounds almost unthinkable. But insiders say that's exactly the fear driving her current moves. Because once the crown passes to William, everything resets. And if you've been paying attention to how William has handled royal restructuring in recent years, something becomes very clear. He doesn't hesitate to make difficult decisions. Whether it's reducing royal roles or redefining who stays within the inner circle, his approach has been described as modern, efficient, and at times, uncompromising. So now the question becomes unavoidable. If Camilla is asking for guarantees, what exactly is she asking to protect? And more importantly, why would William refuse? Because this isn't just about property, it's about control. Reports indicate that Camilla may have sought some form of long-term security tied to royal residences, ensuring stability regardless of future changes. But here's where things shift. Because from William's perspective, every long-term commitment made now could limit his ability to reshape the monarchy later. And that creates a silent clash of visions. On one side, a queen consort trying to secure continuity. On the other, a future king preparing for transformation. But something doesn't fully add up here. If this were only about housing, it wouldn't create this level of tension behind palace walls. So what else is at stake? Because insiders suggest this is just the first of multiple requests, part of a much larger list that goes far beyond where she lives, and moves into something far more sensitive. Titles, status, legacy. And here's where the situation becomes even more complicated. Because in the royal system, nothing is as permanent as it appears. You might assume that once someone becomes queen, that status is locked forever. But according to royal protocol, once the reigning monarch passes, everything shifts. Titles can be redefined. Roles can be adjusted. Even how someone is publicly recognized can change depending on the new monarch's decisions. So imagine the uncertainty. After years of rebuilding public perception, shaping a role, and stepping into one of the most visible positions in the world, the idea that all of it could be quietly restructured under a new reign changes everything. And that's exactly where reports suggest Camilla's second major concern begins. Because it's not just about being remembered as queen. It's about whether that recognition continues after Charles. And here's the tension. William doesn't need to say anything publicly to send a message. Silence, in royal terms, can be more powerful than a statement. And according to multiple reports, that silence is being interpreted inside the palace as deliberate. Not aggressive. Not emotional. But controlled. Strategic. And that raises a deeper question you can't ignore. Is this simply a future king protecting the structure of a modern monarchy? Or is there something more personal shaping these decisions behind the scenes? Because when you look at the history, especially the emotional weight carried by William from the past, it becomes impossible to separate duty from memory. And that's where this story starts to shift from politics into something much more human. Because at its core, this isn't just about documents or guarantees. It's about what happens when legacy, family, and power collide at the exact same moment. And if this is only the beginning, then what comes next might be far more serious than anyone expected. Because once the conversation moves beyond homes and titles, it enters a space the royal family rarely allows the public to see clearly. money, influence, and who truly controls both when the crown changes hands. And if you think that transition happens smoothly, almost automatically, then this next layer will completely change how you see everything. Because reports suggest Camilla's next set of concerns isn't just about dignity or recognition. It's about survival within a system where financial control can quietly determine power. And here's where something critical happens that most people don't fully understand. The moment King Charles III became king, one of the most powerful financial engines in the royal structure didn't stay with him. It transferred. Instantly. Completely. Without negotiation. Straight into the hands of Prince William. And that changes everything. Because what once funded Camilla's lifestyle, her staff, her public work, and even her independence, is no longer under Charles's direct control in the same way. Which means any long-term financial security she hopes to maintain could, at least in part, depend on William's future decisions. Now pause there for a second, because this is where the tension sharpens. If Camilla is seeking guarantees now, before any transition happens, then it suggests one thing very clearly. She may not be confident those assurances will exist later. And according to reports, one of the key areas she is believed to be pushing for is a structured financial arrangement. Something fixed, something protected, something that cannot be easily altered once Charles is no longer there to support her. Because without that, everything becomes uncertain. And here's the uncomfortable reality behind royal life that rarely gets discussed openly. Maintaining that position, even after stepping away from the center of power, requires enormous resources. Security, staffing, residences, travel, public duties. None of it simply disappears. It just shifts, and someone has to authorize it. So the real question becomes unavoidable. Who controls that authorization? Because if it's William, and all signs suggest it will be, then every guarantee made today becomes a limitation on his tomorrow. And that's exactly where the resistance begins. Reports indicate that William's broader vision for the monarchy has always centered around efficiency. A smaller, more focused structure that aligns with public expectations. Less excess. Fewer extended roles. More accountability. Now imagine how that vision fits with long-term financial commitments tied to someone no longer at the core of the institution. It doesn't align easily. And that's why, according to palace insiders, responses to these requests haven't been direct refusals, but something arguably more telling: delays, silence, and careful distance. Because in royal strategy, not committing can be more powerful than saying no. But here's where things take an even more interesting turn. Because money in the royal family isn't just about comfort, it's about independence. And independence means influence. If Camilla secures a strong financial foundation, she retains a degree of autonomy. She continues her initiatives, supports her causes, maintains her network, and remains a visible figure within the royal landscape. But if that support becomes limited, controlled, or reduced over time, then her role doesn't just shrink. It fades. And that possibility appears to be at the center of this quiet negotiation. Now here's the part most people don't see coming. Because alongside financial concerns, there are also reports suggesting discussions around access. Access to assets that symbolize status, continuity, and identity within the monarchy. Things like collections, heirlooms, and items historically associated with the position of queen. And while these may seem symbolic on the surface, their meaning runs much deeper. Because in the royal world, symbols are power. They represent legitimacy, continuity, recognition. So if those symbols are reassigned, restricted, or transitioned to the next generation, particularly to Catherine, Princess of Wales, then the shift becomes visible in a way the public immediately understands. And that's where the emotional tension starts to build. Because this isn't just about objects, it's about what those objects represent. And if Camilla is attempting to secure continued access or association with them, it suggests a deeper concern, not just about her role ending, but about how abruptly that transition could happen. Now think about this from William's perspective. Every decision he makes now sets the tone for his future reign. And if he allows long-term guarantees that tie up resources, influence, or symbolism, he may be limiting his ability to reshape the monarchy the way he believes it needs to evolve. So the hesitation makes sense. But at the same time, so does the urgency from Camilla's side. Because for her, this isn't about long-term strategy. It's about immediate certainty. And those two priorities don't align. Which is exactly why this situation isn't being resolved quickly. Instead, it's stretching, quietly, behind closed doors, where every detail matters and every delay carries meaning. And just when you think this is only about money and influence, another layer begins to surface. Because there's something even more sensitive than financial security or symbolic power. Something far more personal. The people around her. The inner circle that has supported her rise, protected her reputation, and shaped her position inside the royal family for decades. And according to reports, that circle may be at risk too. Which raises the next question you didn't expect. What happens when it's not just roles being redefined, but loyalties being replaced? Because once the conversation shifts from money to people, everything becomes far more personal and far more revealing. Power inside the royal family isn't just about titles or wealth, it's about who stands beside you when everything else starts to change. And according to reports, this is exactly where Camilla's concerns begin to intensify. Because behind every royal figure is a tightly controlled inner circle. Private secretaries, advisors, companions, long-trusted aides. People who don't just manage schedules, but shape influence, protect reputation, and quietly control access. And for years, Queen Camilla has built a network that understands her completely. A system that allowed her to transition from one of the most scrutinized figures in modern royal history into a stable and accepted presence at the top. But here's where things start to shift. Because when the crown changes hands, that entire system doesn't stay in place. It resets. And if you've followed royal transitions in the past, you'll know this isn't unusual, it's expected. A new monarch brings a new structure, a new hierarchy, and most importantly, new loyalties. So now imagine what that means in this situation. Reports suggest that Camilla may be seeking assurances not just for herself, but for the people around her, the individuals who have stood by her through decades of public scrutiny and internal pressure. Because without them, her ability to function within the royal framework changes dramatically. And here's the tension. Those very same individuals may represent, in the eyes of Prince William, a connection to a chapter of royal history he has long been determined to move beyond. So what happens when loyalty to one era becomes a liability in the next? Because insiders indicate that William's long-term approach isn't just about streamlining the monarchy, it's about reshaping its identity. And that doesn't just involve reducing numbers or redefining roles. It involves deciding who remains inside the circle of influence. And who doesn't. Which means any attempt to lock in positions, guarantee roles, or protect existing structures could be seen as resistance to that change. And that's where the quiet conflict deepens. Because from Camilla's perspective, this isn't political, it's personal. These are the people who helped her navigate some of the most difficult periods of her life. The ones who managed the transition, handled the pressure, and stood behind her when public opinion was far from supportive. But from William's perspective, it's structural, strategic, necessary. And that difference in perspective creates a gap that can't easily be bridged. Now here's where things become even more complex. Because this isn't just about keeping staff, it's about maintaining relevance. Without a functioning team, any royal figure, even one with a title, loses the ability to operate effectively. Public engagements slow down. Charitable work becomes harder to coordinate. Media presence fades. Influence, quietly but steadily, diminishes. And that raises a question most people don't consider. What is a royal role without the machinery behind it? Because titles may remain, but visibility is what sustains them. And if that visibility begins to shrink, the public narrative begins to shift with it. Which brings us to something even more sensitive. Legacy. Because according to reports, beyond staffing and structure, there may also be growing concern around how this entire period will eventually be remembered. Not in headlines or short-term coverage, but in the official records, the archives, the long-term story of the monarchy itself. And this is where the stakes become permanent. Because history inside the royal family isn't just recorded, it's curated. Carefully, deliberately, and often quietly influenced by those in power at the time. So if Camilla is thinking about the future, it's not just about where she lives or how she is funded. It's about how she is remembered. And here's where the tension sharpens again. Because once Prince William becomes king, he becomes the ultimate authority over that narrative. The tone of official accounts, the focus of royal exhibitions, the emphasis placed on different eras, all of it can shift subtly, but significantly. Not through dramatic changes, but through what is highlighted and what is not. So if reports suggesting concerns about legacy protection are accurate, then this isn't just about securing a future, it's about preserving a past. Because without that, everything she has built over the last 2 decades could be reframed, or gradually moved to the background. And that's not something that can be reversed later. Now think about the emotional weight behind that. After years of rebuilding public trust, establishing charitable work, and stepping into one of the most scrutinized roles in the world, the idea that the final narrative might not reflect that effort creates a different kind of urgency. A quieter one, but far more lasting. And here's the part that adds another layer to this entire situation. Because while all of this is unfolding in terms of structure, finance, and legacy, there is also a deeply human element running beneath it all. Memory. Because no matter how modern the monarchy becomes, it still carries the emotional history of those within it. And when you look at that history, particularly through William's perspective, it becomes impossible to ignore the influence it may have on present decisions. Not openly, not directly, but subtly, consistently. And that's why this situation feels different. Because it's not driven by a single issue, it's a convergence of multiple pressures happening at the same time. Structural change, personal history, institutional control, and public perception, all intersecting in one moment. Which is why nothing is being resolved quickly. Because every decision here doesn't just affect the present. It defines the future. And just when it seems like this is about systems, staff, and strategy, another layer begins to emerge. One that isn't about roles or resources, but about something far more powerful inside the monarchy. Perception, public image, and the one comparison that has never truly disappeared, no matter how much time has passed. Because as this quiet negotiation continues behind palace walls, there's a shadow that still hasn't left the room. Because no matter how carefully this transition is being managed behind palace doors, there is one presence that continues to shape everything, even decades later. Not through official statements, not through policy, but through memory, emotion, and public perception. And that presence is Diana, Princess of Wales. Now here's where the situation becomes even more delicate. Because this isn't something anyone inside the royal family openly discusses, yet it quietly influences how every decision is interpreted. Because for millions of people around the world, Diana was never just a royal figure. She became a symbol. And symbols don't fade the way roles do. So when reports suggest that Camilla is seeking not just security, but also a form of long-term narrative protection, it begins to make more sense. Because this isn't only about how she lives after Charles. It's about how she is seen. And more importantly, how she is remembered in comparison to someone whose legacy still defines the emotional core of the monarchy. Now pause for a moment and think about that tension. On one side, a woman who spent decades rebuilding her public image, slowly transitioning from controversy into acceptance, stepping into the role of queen consort with measured composure. On the other, a legacy that remains untouched, almost frozen in time, protected not just by history, but by public sentiment that never fully shifted. And right in the middle of that stands Prince William. Because for him, this isn't abstract. It's personal. Deeply personal. And while he rarely speaks about it directly, his actions over the years have often reflected a careful, almost deliberate approach to how his mother's memory is preserved. Not aggressively, not emotionally in public, but consistently. Which brings us to a question that changes how you see everything unfolding right now. If Camilla is seeking assurances about how she will be positioned in the future, who ultimately controls that positioning? Because the answer is simple. The future king. And that's why this part of the story carries a different kind of weight. Because reports suggest that one of the more sensitive concerns involves how future royal events, exhibitions, and commemorations will present this era of the monarchy. Not rewriting history, but shaping how it is framed, what is emphasized, and how different figures are placed within that narrative. And here's where things get complicated. Because no matter how carefully that balance is managed, the comparison will always exist. Not because anyone creates it, but because the public already holds it. And that creates a challenge that goes beyond policy or protocol. It becomes emotional. Now imagine the timing of all of this. Because in the coming years, certain anniversaries and moments tied to Diana's legacy will naturally bring renewed attention, renewed reflection, and renewed comparisons. And according to reports, there may be quiet concern about how those moments could reshape public perception once again. Not dramatically, not overnight, but gradually. And that's where the fear begins to take shape. Because if the narrative begins to shift back toward the past, then everything built in the present could begin to feel temporary. Which leads to another layer of this situation that most people don't immediately see. Recognition. Because inside the monarchy, recognition isn't just about titles, it's about placement. Who stands where, who is acknowledged in what way, who is given visibility, and who gradually moves into the background. And those decisions, while subtle, are incredibly powerful. So if Camilla is seeking clarity on how she will be positioned after Charles, it suggests an awareness that without defined recognition, her role could become increasingly symbolic rather than active. And that shift, once it begins, is very difficult to reverse. Now here's where the tension becomes even more pronounced. Because from William's perspective, the monarchy's future depends on clarity, simplicity, and strong public connection. And part of that may involve focusing attention on a new generation, particularly alongside Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose role is already being shaped as central to that future. Which means, whether intentionally or not, space has to be created. And when space is created, something else moves aside. So the question becomes unavoidable. Is this a natural transition within a modern monarchy? Or is it a quiet rebalancing influenced by history that was never fully resolved? Because depending on how you look at it, both can be true at the same time. And that's what makes this situation so complex. Because there is no single motive driving these decisions. There is duty. There is strategy. There is public expectation. And beneath all of that, there is memory. Now consider this. If no formal assurances are given, if no clear positioning is defined, and if the narrative is allowed to evolve naturally under a new reign, then over time, perception may begin to shift on its own. Not through confrontation, but through absence. Less visibility, fewer mentions, gradual repositioning. And before anyone fully notices, the role that once stood at the center of the monarchy begins to feel distant. And that possibility appears to be at the heart of what's happening right now. Because this isn't just about holding on to influence. It's about avoiding disappearance. And that brings us to something even more unexpected. Because while much of this discussion has focused on Camilla's position, her future, and her legacy, there is another dimension quietly emerging behind the scenes. One that involves not just how she is seen, but who is allowed to be part of that future at all. Because reports suggest that this isn't only about her role within the monarchy, but about whether that connection extends beyond her, to her family, to her lineage, to what remains after everything else changes. And that's where this story takes a turn no one saw coming. Because when the focus shifts from position to legacy, everything becomes far more final. Not temporary arrangements, not short-term adjustments, but what remains after the transition is complete. And according to reports, this is where the most sensitive and quietly controversial discussions begin to surface. Because it's not just about how Queen Camilla will live, or how she will be seen. It's about who, if anyone, carries her presence forward inside the monarchy once King Charles III is no longer there to anchor it. And that introduces a question the institution rarely confronts directly. Can a legacy exist inside the royal family without direct lineage? Because when you look at how the monarchy traditionally operates, continuity is everything. Titles, roles, influence, they don't just move randomly, they follow a line. A very specific line. And that line is built around succession. Which means anyone outside of it, no matter how close they once stood, eventually finds themselves on the edge of that structure. And according to multiple reports, this may be one of Camilla's most difficult realities to accept. Because while she has secured her place beside the king, Her connection to the future of the monarchy is far less defined. And that's where the next layer of tension begins. Because there have been suggestions, carefully framed, never officially confirmed, that discussions may have touched on recognition beyond her own role. Not formal titles necessarily, not direct integration into the core structure, but some form of acknowledgement that preserves a connection between her family and the institution she spent decades becoming part of. And if that's true, then it reveals something deeper. Because this isn't just about status. It's about permanence. Now pause and think about that. If no recognition exists beyond her lifetime, then everything she has built, every step, every transition, every effort to reshape perception, remains contained within a single chapter. A chapter that begins with Charles and ends with him. And that's a very different kind of legacy. Because it doesn't extend. It concludes. And according to insiders, this is precisely where resistance from Prince William becomes most defined. Because his vision for the monarchy has always been described as streamlined, focused, and firmly centered on direct succession. A structure where roles are clear, responsibilities are limited, and the public understands exactly who represents the institution at its core. Now place that vision against the idea of extending recognition beyond that line. It doesn't align. And that's why, according to reports, there has been little movement on any proposals that would expand that boundary. Not publicly rejected, but quietly set aside. And that silence, once again, says more than a direct answer ever could. But here's where the emotional weight of this situation reaches its peak. Because beyond structure, beyond policy, beyond long-term strategy, there is something much more human driving these concerns. Fear of being forgotten. Not immediately. Not dramatically, but gradually. Because inside an institution that has existed for centuries, relevance is constantly shifting. New figures rise, new priorities emerge, and attention naturally moves forward. And when that happens, those no longer at the center don't disappear overnight. They fade. And that fading doesn't require conflict. It happens through time, through focus, through what is emphasized, and what is no longer needed. So if Camilla is seeking guarantees now, at this moment, it suggests something very specific. She understands exactly how that process works. And she is trying, in whatever ways possible, to shape it before it begins. But here's the part that makes this situation even more complex. Because from William's perspective, shaping the future may require letting the past settle into its place naturally. Not erasing it, not rewriting it, but allowing the monarchy to move forward without being tied too tightly to previous chapters. And that creates a fundamental conflict. One side seeking preservation, the other seeking progression, and both, in their own way, justified. Now consider what happens next. If no formal guarantees are made, if no extended recognition is established, and if the monarchy transitions exactly as William envisions, then over time, the structure becomes clearer. More focused, more defined. And within that structure, certain roles remain central, while others become part of history. Respected, acknowledged, but no longer active in shaping what comes next. And that may be the outcome Camilla is trying to avoid. Because for her, this isn't just about the end of a role. It's about the end of influence. And once that line is crossed, there is no returning. Which brings us to the final, most unsettling layer of this entire situation. Because beyond homes, titles, finances, staff, legacy, and recognition, there is one thing that no document, no agreement, no guarantee can truly secure: public perception. Because in the end, the monarchy doesn't exist only through law or tradition. It exists through how people feel about it. And that feeling can't be controlled. Not completely. Not permanently. So the real question isn't just what happens inside the palace. It's what happens outside it. Because if public sentiment shifts, if attention moves, if the narrative evolves in ways no one can fully predict, then even the strongest guarantees may not hold the meaning they once did. And that's why this entire situation feels different from anything we've seen before. Because it's not just a transition of power. It's a transition of perception. And as that transition approaches, one question remains: quiet, unresolved, but impossible to ignore. When the crown changes hands, who truly decides what remains, and what is left behind? Because whatever the answer is, it won't just define one person's future. It will define how this entire chapter of the monarchy is remembered, and whether it closes, or quietly lingers long after the crown has moved on. And now it comes down to you. After everything we've explored, the quiet negotiations, the reported tensions, the shifting balance of power, one question remains at the center of it all. When the moment finally comes, should Prince William protect the future of the monarchy at all costs, or ensure that Queen Camilla is given lasting security and recognition? Is this a necessary evolution of the royal system, or does it risk becoming something far more personal beneath the surface? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read them all, and this is one of those debates where every perspective matters. If you found this breakdown insightful, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because in the next deep dive, we're uncovering another layer of this story. Reports surrounding private conversations between King Charles III and his inner circle that could completely change how you see what's coming next. And trust me, if what's been hinted at is even partially true, this situation is far from over.